crazy or not crazy? I didn't recognize I was in an abusive situation, partly because of brain damage and brainwashing. Leave your questions and 5-star review here, or go to livebrighter.info for more information. John 4:18 says, perfect love casts out fear. If someone says that they love you and you find that you have fear all the time, that's a big red flag. If you're in a relationship and you have a problem and you go to that person and they say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have a problem. We don't have a problem. But if you have a problem and you're married or in a relationship, you both have a problem. And that's a great time to get some help, get some counseling. A lot of us haven't been taught how to have the healthiest versions of relationship, and we don't know it all. It's a great opportunity to learn and grow. Consider not going to a Christian counselor that's just from the church that hasn't been adequately changed. They may say something like, this is what I got. You just need to submit more. You just need to work on you. That doesn't work when you're in a relationship that is destructive. So something to consider. Brainwashing. What I was told. I was told by my spouse at the time that I was the problem. That was regularly reiterated to me. So if I would bring up something that I wanted to talk about, I would be either ignored for 6 days or just he wouldn't talk about it. And then if I tried to bring it up again, he would ignore me for another 6 days. So I never was able to talk about anything that actually mattered to me. And I was always told that I was the problem and I was not enough. I couldn't keep the house clean enough. Which was a big deal because he is a perfectionist. So leaving papers out or leaving a pencil out, that was another good thing to set up for me being ignored for a certain time, which is called stonewalling and passive aggressive. Not good. But being told something over and over, that actually affects your brain. And that causes, you can call it brainwashing, you can call it trauma, all sorts of things. You'll hear this from, it could be a mixture, like in my case, my husband at the time was called highly Aspergerish. I didn't know that actually until a year after, we parted ways. But that's what his counselor later told me. But it could be the same sort of situation where you feel gaslit, where it's like, you are the problem. It's not me. You're the problem. And that could come from like a narcissist or just somebody that's really selfish. And that doesn't feel good because as a couple, however that looks, you are a team. So let's go back to my story. So before I got married to Mark, one of the things that I said is like, I'm very much kind of a realist. Like, when we have problems, the one thing that's super important to me is that you'll go to counseling. We'll go to counseling together. And that was super important to me. Well, gosh, like I mentioned in episode 1, big shift during the honeymoon, big shift. And so a year of that, and I just was not feeling good, and the relationship was very destructive. So I brought up, hey, I mentioned that I really like to go to counseling. And his response was, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't say that. And that was just, again, more of a gaslighting thing. And if you know anything about an Aspergerish or somebody on the high autism scale, because they actually don't call it Asperger anymore, is that they can't actually see other realities. They really struggle with that, and they lack empathy. So that put me in a challenge, because what I learned is like, I'm a very high sensitive person. I can feel things and sense things about people's emotions, and that most people can't, or I shouldn't say most people, there's about 20% of us. And that can be really challenging to live with. So I go through the first 5 years, and we decided to have a child, and there was just a conglomeration of things that happened. So again, I was undiagnosed Hashimoto's. Right after having my daughter Madison, my thyroid was going into hyperthyroidism, just losing weight, couldn't keep it on, just fatigue, my hair started falling out. The challenge is I didn't get the right test done, and I didn't know that there was a specific Hashimoto's test because my thyroid test came back normal, my TSH. So that was challenging. I have a pre-med degree, which is just enough to know something's wrong, but not enough to really advocate for myself. I'm much better at it now. So not only was I misdiagnosed with Hashimoto's, or not diagnosed, that was actually diagnosed 8 years later when they thought I had thyroid cancer, removed my thyroid, and they're like, oops, you have Hashimoto's and you've had it since you were a teenager. So imagine, I just had a baby, so probably some postpartum depression in there. My marriage is a shit show, and there's just that passive aggressive, regular, unequal does it really matter? I feel like I'm really not part of the relationship at all, and I don't have any influence. And definitely not equals. On top of that, I ended up taking an antibiotic, and I could really tell a shift in my body. At the time, again, my ex was not a supportive person. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Antibiotics don't do that. But I'll tell you, your gut health very much affects your brain health, and that is much more known now. But I could definitely tell a difference after I took that antibiotic. So that combination of all of that, and I just basically started getting 3 hours of sleep a night, and just my mind was just going and going, super stressed about the marriage, not wanting it, not happy with it, not having really a say though, and feeling very trapped by my own ideologies. So then, as I mentioned in the first episode, I tried to get away from it, go to Oregon, and at the time, instead of getting the help and support I needed from my more distant relatives, they colluded with my husband and took my daughter away from me, and that was just traumatizing to me. And I will say, I was not thinking well either, because I'm a year into sleeping about 3 hours a day. Unfortunately, I understand I was not thinking well, and it was like, okay, what's going on? Is it her? Is it him? And he just had a beautiful veneer. Everyone just really looked up to him and really didn't understand what my life was like, nor did, when I explained it, did I have the words to even just explain it well. So anyways, I did not react well, did not like that, flooded my aunt's bathroom, and got sent to the psych ward. It's time to change the way you see yourself from God's perspective. Click the link below to get free affirmations and printable affirmations to support you in your Live Brighter journey. So at the psych ward, it was very interesting to me because they didn't care, if I had a bad relationship or a bad marriage, and at that time I was pretty vocal about it. And basically I got labeled as bipolar, and all they cared about is getting me on medication. And let me just say a disclaimer right now. If you have been labeled with bipolar or anything else, and you're taking medication, I do not advocate getting off of it or changing anything like that. If that is improving your quality of life, it's super important to just stay with that. I only got off because the doctors got me off. That was kind of an interesting situation. So not only at that point then, I got labeled as bipolar and kind of a mania situation where they, kept having this group think saying that, that was the problem, and I was in a great marriage with a great guy, and it was really my bipolar. So I didn't know how to respond to that. I'm a teachable individual, and so I just adopted that philosophy that I was bipolar. The interesting thing with bipolar, there's a couple different forms, but even on medication, so bipolar is highs and lows, and even when I got on medication, I just, usually you still have highs and lows, and I really didn't, because in my case, it wasn't bipolar, it was like trauma, little t trauma, and that was just not connected. And that's something that's really not great about our medical system, and it's improved, especially psychiatric system, is that they disconnect the past, what's going on right now, from just the diagnosis and then them being on medication. That is just horrible, because a lot of what we're going through and a lot of our past really affects our mental health now and can be really impactful. Even with the diagnosis, there's so much that can be done by just improving our mental health and our habits and our self-care. But, Western medicine has tried to separate all that, and really we're a combination of spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, and all of those actually go together. So again, I had the group think and the brainwashing, and not only from my husband at the time that I'm the problem, then I got it from the medical community that I'm bipolar, and that's the problem. So I was a very diligent patient, stuck on the medication, accepted the diagnosis, and started talking to others and be like, I guess I'm bipolar. What I found out is, I was in a Christian church and everything, is that most people had mental health challenges. I was not alone, and I really believe, we're all struggling in some way. The big thing, though, is mental health challenges, whether it be bipolar, relational, whatever, they all affect your brain. And it's all like brain damage, brainwashing, All of that's related, which is super interesting. So we talk about trauma. Like we all know about big T trauma, and that would be like maybe a rape, a death in the family, an auto accident, something impactful. But so much less is talked about little T trauma. And those are just the regular little traumas, and that's what really affected me. That's what affects a lot of people. I was just constantly being traumatized. I'm not enough. And me just kept working harder and harder on that little hamster wheel, working myself to death, and just never like having, really not having the relationship. More criticism was criticism pretty much generalized the relationship. So it was continually traumatizing to me because as a people pleaser at the time, I was really wanting to please my husband. And so just not being able to really get too far in that area. But little T traumas could be bullying. It could be with a work environment where there's just a regular, just toxic environment. Little T traumas can happen in like the way that we're raised in some ways, just regularly told things. And so those things actually impact your brain. Somebody that's really made a big impact on me, and there's a number of wonderful doctors that are now more holistic, was Dr. Amen. And he talks a lot. Basically, he got into doing brain scans and brain imaging. And basically, which, it was funny when he all started this, he's like, all the other doctors, if they're a liver specialist, lung specialist, they analyze it and test it and see it. And why don't they do brain scans with psychiatric? And so he started doing that with a lot of criticism, but now he's done lots and lots of brain scans, has several different locations, and is quite impactful in the ways of our mental health and how our brain works. And so that's really fascinating. So Michael, my husband right now, we actually went to the Amen Clinic and, had a SPECT imaging done. And what his brain showed, and I'm sure my brain would have been totally like that, is his emotion center in the center of his brain was totally lit up. And that has to do with trauma. Trauma that's not resolved. And basically it gets stuck there and isn't in the history part of the brain. One of the ways you know that is like if you think about a situation, experience, or something like that, and you feel the same emotion that you did when it happened or very close, then that's in the trauma part of your brain. And what happens is there's like this desire to just, even if it's subconscious, there's a desire just to soothe and calm that. That can be very impactful in a person's life. So back to my story. What happened for me, now I can look back and understand it a little more, is, married for 5 years, just traumatized because it was really destructive 5 years, traumatized, have a baby, all of that, diagnosed with bipolar. And eventually what happened is the doctors took me off medication because I didn't line up with quite the pattern. So got off medication, was doing really well, had another 5-year bout of abuse that was just worse. And that, again, all had to do with a comment that I had mentioned after church, like, what did you think of the sermon? And that was, for some reason, like the root of bitterness. And then the bitterness was my fault because, again, everything was my fault and he was perfect. And so he felt quite justified in the way he was criticizing. Wasn't thin enough, wasn't just pretty enough, couldn't keep the house clean enough, just wasn't enough all the time. And I just couldn't reconcile that, like how somebody could be so, like, what felt so unloving to me and then say that they love me. That's called a cognitive dissonance. And in my brain, I just couldn't handle that. And I just stopped sleeping again. So then I got on medication, and that's when I realized, okay, I don't think I'm the problem, and obviously, I had my part of the problem, but I felt like there was more going on and opened my mind to investigating that. So what happens is if we have trauma, brain damage, our brains are wired in pathways that are destructive and unhealthy for us. And no matter if you're on medication, no matter if whatever your struggle is, there's so much we can do to help that. Because if we don't deal with that subconscious and those challenges and those traumas, is again self-soothing. And self-soothing, boy, there's tons of ways to self-soothe. There's you could be, I self-soothe with busyness and all sorts of things. You can do drugs, porn, alcohol, denial. And I just basically eventually just had a mental breakdown and just couldn't handle it. So brainwashing can cause brain damage. So It's very important for us to know like who we're around, what we're exposing ourselves to, both with people around us, what we watch on TV, what we watch on social media, because all of that affects our brain. Abuse causes brain damage. Wow. Mental illness can cause brain damage. All of this affects our brain. The next episode, we're going to talk about the addictive side of abuse, because there's an addictive side to it, and I can totally understand that. And then we're going to talk about ways to rewire our brain, because there's actually a lot of different options to rewire and soothe our brain once we realize that we need to improve that. And honestly, I think I'm always going to need to improve that and work on that. We all have mental challenges, whether you're in an abusive situation or you've had challenges from your past, or you've had little t traumas or big T traumas. We all struggle, and that's just very common, and you're not alone. Be kind and compassionate to yourself. Love yourself by knowing yourself and caring for yourself. I believe in you. Let your light shine brighter.